Listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and or good morning for some of you folks out there. This is Eric Bruns. I'm here in Olympia, Washington, and I'm going to kick off this latest edition of the National Wraparound Initiative's webinar series on supporting and implementing high-quality wraparound for children and families. Our topic today is Directive Supervision, and we're very pleased here at the National Wraparound Initiative to have with us 4 presenters on this topic of using data-driven directive supervision methods to reinforce high-quality wraparound practice. Our presenters today on this webinar are going to be Pat Miles of Pat Miles Consulting, from, is it Gresham, Oregon, Pat? Is that correct?
Sure.
Sure?
Yeah.
Pat's from Oregon. Pat is from Oregon, and she is an expert wraparound trainer and thinker who has consulted with many states, counties, and provider organizations nationally. And she is going to be joined by 3 folks from Kapolei Sycamores in Los Angeles County, California. And they can provide more details about their specific roles in Kapolei Sycamores. But those folks are Debbie Manners, Gloria Spalding, and Tanya Milikowski. And the reason we have Pat, Debbie, Gloria, and Tanya here today to present on the topic of directive supervision is that, you know, it's been increasingly noted both in wraparound practice, but also social services in general, that ensuring high-quality practice often requires clarity around the job expectations of staff who are being asked to implement different kinds of social service models. And that kind of clarity of expectation can be reinforced by the use of supervision methods that use data to ensure that staff are performing as expected, that expectations are clear among staff and supervisors, and that attention is paid to whether or not practice models and values are in fact being implemented as intended in the course of implementing something like wraparound or any other kind of social service model. And that supervision and effective supervision has a big role to play in that. Pat, Debbie, Gloria, and Tanya have been working together for some years, I believe, and they'll tell us about that journey, to design and implement a directive supervision model for their wraparound practice. And we're pleased to have them here today to describe how they do that work and some of the lessons learned in how to use directive supervision methods to reinforce the quality of their wraparound practice. So I'm going to hand it over with that first to Sarah Peterson from Portland State University, who is helping facilitate this webinar. She's going to give us some technical details on the webinar, and then from there we're going to kick it off with Debbie Manners from Kapolei Sycamores. So Sarah, tell us a little bit about the webinar.
All right, so just a couple quick things about how to use GoToWebinar. Make sure to move any electronic handheld devices away from your computer and speakers to improve the sound quality. We also recommend that you close all file sharing applications like your email or streaming music or video. If you're having problems with your audio, you can check your audio settings to make sure that those are correct. And also during the presentation, you can send questions to the webinar organizer, but we're going to hold these until the end. All audience members will be muted until the question and answer, at which time you can electronically raise your hand and then we can unmute your line individually. And also a recording of this webinar and the PowerPoint slides will be available on the NWI website later today. And so that's that, and I'll let the presentation go to the presenters.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I'm Debbie Manners. I am the Senior Executive Vice President here at Kapolei Sycamores Child and Family Services. I've worked at the organization for about 24 years. And I want to just begin the presentation with setting the stage for how we came to begin directive supervision. As with many child welfare organizations, we started out as an orphanage in the early 1900s. We were a residential service provider in the 80s and 90s, one of the first service providers to really start looking at how to craft a treatment program and to move away from just housing children. We expanded our services in the late 90s into in-home foster care. We were one of the first mental health providers to provide mental health services to foster care children in Los Angeles County. In 2005, we merged with a similar size organization, hence the name Kapolei Sycamores. And currently we're serving about 8,000 children across Los Angeles County. And for those of you who've come to Los Angeles County, it's about the size of a state. And geographically, it can take several hours to get from one end to the other, east or west or north or south. So it's a pretty large county, and it really involves a lot of travel to provide community-based services. We were one of the first wraparound providers in 1998, and that really was the beginning of thinking about utilizing values and providing services to kids and families, and it was what attracted us to Wraparound. And we started thinking about doing the work differently when you start using a value to guide your practice, and what that really meant for clinicians specifically, moving away from always being the expert and having all the answers. And then we were also interested in just the funding mechanism behind Wraparound in Los Angeles County. It was a braided funding. It was a combination of placement money from the Department of Child and Family Services and mental health money. And it also had some flexible funds available to provide more of the concrete services and support that families could access for any kinds of services that they needed. Next slide. Oh, next slide. We were also interested in really the way that Wraparound was developed in the county, because it was the first time in LA County there was going to be a screening process or gatekeeping for how kids and families got services. And the services were going to be in some ways regulated, and there was an oversight screening committee to begin analyzing the goals that were developed for the kids and families and looking at how the work was happening. So that was something new for the county, and it was new for us as a provider in working with the county. And then lastly, we were really inspired by having a parent there on the team to provide support and services to kids and families. And we were inspired because we had worked with children and families for so many years in residential, and really were committed to family reunification and committed to engaging families, but we're really lost for words on how to do that. And in having a parent partner there, not only were the parents available to help support the kids and families, but they were there to really become change agents in the organization and to change the view that the staff held about families, and really moved the agency culture to become more family-driven and family-centered. So what was, next slide, what was kind of a aha moment for the leadership was, okay, we have this treatment philosophy, which is the core values in Wraparound. This is really kind of a strength-based, needs-driven, family-focused, culturally competent treatment approach. And we know how to train, we can talk about it, we can articulate those values, we can run around and hang them up on the wall and do all the dressing around it, but how do we really get that in practice? And we spent a lot of time and energy in training, and we soon realized that people were inspired in the room, but they left and did the same thing. so we wanted to impact practice, and we realized the only way to do that was through supervision. And we realized that if we were dependent on the clinical supervisors or the leads or any other kind of manager to provide the supervision, they would separate the values from how they did the work. And we needed to really marry those two. So we really wanted, the next question then was, can we make the values real in practice, and can we grow our program without losing the integrity? How do we really expand Wraparound or these values across our organization, and can we do that without losing the integrity? And then the next key question was, do staff expectations match the values? So the way that the staff do the work and the way that they practice, does it really match the values? And can we have competent, skilled practitioners whose competencies and skills reflect those values? And in really thinking about those two, how do we marry them in a supervision model? And so that was really one of the aha moments that we had. So next slide. So as an organization, I'm sure with a lot of organizations, we had hundreds of role descriptions, and any time we found that something wasn't getting done, we began, we would throw another person at it, and we would create another role description, and anyone basically could create a role description. And so while we were trying to transform the organization to practice under these core set of values, we had folks who were going out and creating positions and writing role descriptions that weren't in any way reflective of these values. So we decided we needed to pull everybody in and really develop competency-based role descriptions that reflected the values and the practice that we wanted to see in the staff. And so we brought groups of employees together in day-long workshops, and we divided these groups into what we called really three groups. They were the staff who provided the service, the staff who arranged for the service, and the staff who managed or led the service. And the reason that we did that was we really, not only did we want to reduce the number of role descriptions that we had, but we wanted to standardize the process for developing role descriptions, and we wanted to standardize the format of the role description. And we became very rigid about the role descriptions. And it was upsetting to a lot of folks because they felt like they were losing control over their departments. But it was really well thought out strategy to bring people along and get them on board. And we realized just in the process of changing the role descriptions, and that was probably 10 years ago that we started that process. 10 years later, we still have pockets of people who weren't necessarily sold into that process, trying to sneak role descriptions through our Human Resources Department. And our Human Resources Department has become one of the strongest advocates of the streamlining and standardization of these role descriptions. So we use the role descriptions then to develop kind of our core training model, and looking at the competencies that are in the role descriptions and how do we train to them so that there's consistency across the expectation for the staff, what they will receive training in, and how they're supervised. And so this really began to provide a range of tools for supervisors to support, supervise, and ensure competent employees. Next slide. So our staff roles were divided into, as I said before, interveners and arrangers. So the definition of an intervener is really someone who delivers direct help versus an organizer, or versus organizing help, which is more of an arranger. So that would be, in Wraparound, it would be more of a facilitator. In other parts of the organization, it's a case manager, a care coordinator, a caseworker. Those are all more of the kind of arranger functions, where in the intervener, they're really the youth specialist, the psychiatrist, teacher, therapist, clinician, and they really are the folks who provide the direct intervention to reach the goals that are developed in the care plan. Next slide. So in looking at how the job descriptions were organized, they were really broken up into two different categories. We had the direct customer care, which were really built around the phases of health, which is really the welcoming and intake planning, providing, and transitioning. And then on the other side is more the phases of management, which is really initiating, organizing, managing, or modifying, initiating, organizing, and managing. And so on the administrative management side, that was really where anyone who provided any supervision or support would have that type of role description. And even if they had a dual role where they were providing some management and some direct service delivery, they still had a role description that was in the indirect customer care administration area. Next slide. So in the job description process, in developing the managers' role descriptions, we really sat down with the managers and had them talk about what it was that they did. How did they provide support and supervision and management in their roles? And how could we get consistency across those job roles? And how could we develop universal skills that every manager or every intervener and arranger would have to practice and become competent in those universal skills? Next slide. So in kind of thinking about this framework that we put in place, it was really clear that we were not going to have Wraparound as a boutique program in our organization, that we were really going to use a lot of the values and principles of Wraparound across our organization for every program and service that we provided, because if we knew that that is what worked and served kids and families best, why would we only limit it to those who could come through that door of Wraparound? And why would we not then expand that and organize ourselves to really provide a Wraparound-like approach across the organization? So we wanted to make some fundamental shifts in our practice, and so we did that through the job descriptions, and we did that by moving away from the practitioner as expert to really partnering through the team and also partnering with the families. And one of the most powerful aspects of that was really, again, the role of the parent partner in providing peer-to-peer support. And in recognition of those outcomes in providing family support, we rapidly expanded the number of parent partners, and we invested in that capacity not only within Wraparound but across our organization. And one of the probably most notable programs that Kapolei Sycamores has gotten recognition for in the last probably 5 or 6 years has not only been our peer-to-peer support program, but a program which is now known in the state as RBS, Residentially Based Services, but was known in LA County for Kapolei Sycamores as ResWrap, where we really took a look at how could we change the practice in residential and overlay the values of Wraparound, bring in facilitators and parents, and do more of a reaching in model into our residential program. And we did a pilot for that, and what we realized is that where there was the presence of a family partner or a parent partner in engaging the family member is when we had the best outcomes. So that once again reinforced what we already knew, but became more public in the county, was the power of a parent partner. So our parent partner leader in our organization, Gloria Spalding, is going to talk to you about the role of the parent partner within Halfway Sycamores.
Hi, this is Gloria. I'm Assistant Vice President of Peer-to-Peer Support. I've been with the agency about 8 years. Directive Supervision originally started in peer-to-peer support. We started peer-to-peer support in 2000 with only one parent partner, and by 2004, when we started Directive Supervision, we'd grown to about a staff of 12. We were already working with other programs within the agency, and we had started to discover that we were struggling with how to provide effective supervision for our staff and keep it skill-based and not so much on what the family was doing, but what we as skilled interveners were doing with the families. We found that families were presenting situations to the parent partners that the parent partners were struggling with, and so we wanted to make sure that the skills that we were using in all the various different departments that we were working in were the same skills or the same base skills, but basically the tasks we were seeing were just a little bit different. What Directive Supervision allowed us to do was to open a very interactive door between the supervisor and the staff and to get feedback from supervisors, from the staff, as well as from families, so that we could build a very good base to work with families and build skills within the staff. It helped the supervisors and staff understand that families in Wraparound, as well as within other programs, were the ones that made the decisions, and that the parent partners or the staff did not make the decisions for them. And oftentimes, as a parent partner, we found that using our life experience, giving information to families, we would find that sometimes we might be making the decision for the staff or for the families, and that wasn't what we needed to do. And Directive Supervision helps us keep on task in supporting the families. It helps focus the supervisor and the parent partner on very skill-based interventions instead of us kind of reactively running helter-skelter all around the place. Next slide, please. It provided consistent feedback and documentation from supervisor to employee to family. The momentum of our workforce, we wanted to make sure that our our skills were based on our job description. We wanted to keep the values that we were using within our trainings and within our organizations and working with our families on. We wanted to make sure that we were able to incorporate those and keep those very strong within our practice. We wanted to make sure that the interventions that we were providing had a very good, solid integration base versus absorbing all the speak and not actually working on what the parent partners needed to be able to work on with the families on. Focusing with the families on peer support and how the staff was able to be more proactive with the families and practice with the families and not be so reactive. Directive Supervision was very critical in this point for staff as well as for families. The big idea was to use our supervision as a means to manage and support our staff instead of running reactively with sometimes the threats that came back or what the staff perceived as possible threats to what they needed to do with families. We also, you want to do the poll now? No?
No, I'll talk about directive supervision.
Okay, that's cool.
So, Gloria and Debbie, this cat, Miles, from Gresham Logan. Gloria and Debbie have talked about the fact that you've had top-level buy-in to this notion of peer support, and that Gloria was part of the task of expanding both wide and deep with the peer support model while transforming the treatment design. And that what we found is that people were value smart but not necessarily practice smart. And one of the big concerns in particular, as Gloria has spoken to, is how did you know that staff knew what to do, not just knew what the values were. So I was tasked by, at that time, Gloria's boss, who may be out there, Joanne Huss, to go home and think about this supervision model and then come back with some kind of model we could put in place to position the department with being able to transition in the best possible way. And so if we go to we're talking about the slide about what is directive supervision, what we created, is we created a three-tiered model of supervision that has three components. One is direct communication about values, but more importantly, translating values into action so that people aren't telling you what they believe, but they're demonstrating what they can do, and that is coherent with what they believe. The second was to give supervisors concrete behaviorally based skills that will help them translate values into concrete actions, as well as correcting staff behavior when they get in trouble. And then the third component was to create a data review system that would allow multiple impressions of performance to be considered. And so those are the components of directive supervision. It's really about moving the system from supervisor as the expert that people go to with problems about families that they're stuck with to supervisor as the skill transfer unit, so that families are met by people who get to work with them directly with the broadest and deepest range of skills possible. And the big shift, as Gloria mentioned, is moving staff away from talking about how families are with staff to how staff are with families, so that you can see whether your people are practicing or staying in their lane. And so if you go to the next slide, very quickly, this just, if you can start advancing these, Sarah, that would be great. This just describes the process from new hire to competent staff that we originally laid out on a whiteboard that said, you orient people, you train people, but what we want to do is we want to start engaging staff in a self-reflection to say, after you find out where the coffee is and where you're supposed to turn in your time card, really what are the practices that we're expecting you to have, rather than these are the values or you're gilded in with a certain license, therefore we assume you practice our way. Because the big epiphany was there was the traditional way of doing business, there was the alternative way of doing business, and then there was the Kapolei Sycamores way of doing business, and you wanted that to affect all 8,500 kids. So you can see the first column in that handout just describes kind of the basic approach, but it says we want staff to self-reflect from hire. And then what we want to do is we want to gather inputs and aggregate the inputs. And so at least 3 times in the first 6 months of a new hire, we want staff to self-rate their confidence in performing the task. We also want supervisors to blindly, not seeing the staff rating, but blindly rate as well. And then we want to ask this next question, which is the third party of the family. Not are you satisfied, are you happy with your practitioner, but are they practicing in a way that we said we wanted them to practice. And that you would do monthly talent reviews combining that feedback to say, do we have a customer-focused approach? Do we have staff that are competent? And do we have supervisors that are confident in their staff competence? And what we hoped to by doing this was to certify 2 competent staff. Now seems like a good time to do the first poll. So Sarah, you're supposed to do some magic now, right?
Okay. Yep, so the poll is launched now.
And now do we sit quietly and wait for the poll?
Yeah, we'll just give the audience a few seconds to vote. Looks like quite a few are coming in right now. We're at about 35%, 50% now. All All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results.
I can't read that, I'm old.
So it looks like 42% said that they regularly incorporated staff self-ratings into their performance reviews. And 28% said yes, sometimes. So it looks like the audience is doing that.
Okay. So if we can go to the next slide. This is just to quickly go over the initial pilot launch. In 2004, after we designed the system, we initiated the first attempt to implement directive supervision, all 6 skills, all 3 components in the division of peer-to-peer support. And the model was clearly applied for direct care staff, and quite frankly, Gloria was the original guinea pig. What we were trying to do is say, how can we get tools in place, and how does that affect practice? And we had Gloria gathering a whole bunch of information and trying to analyze it and use it to improve staff performance. The things that we learned from that initial pilot is that the analytic detail could be overwhelming, that we spent a tremendous amount of time gathering detail, the detail around what parent partners were doing, the detail about what the results of service and supports were, and what we learned from that is that getting stuck in the detail didn't make practitioners or supervisors any smarter or more effective. And so what happened is people just got high-centered on too much detail, which didn't necessarily help them be able to coach staff kind of out of the woods of doing the work with families. Anything you guys want to add to that?
No, this is Gloria. I agree. We got caught in a huge detail hell, as we could say. It didn't support. In fact, we spent a lot of time, which was not helpful for staff and definitely not helpful for the supervisor.
So, next slide. Get some starts.
This is Tanya. I'm the Vice President of Community-Based Services here at Kapolei Sycamores, and I'll be covering our Fit and Start, the pilot with Gloria, and then deeper into parent partnerships allowed us for a 2-supervisor trial implementation because the parent partners at that time were spread out among departments in the organization. There were multiple supervisors kind of sharing some joint supervision. So that allowed us to really take a look at how the supervision was being implemented and where we were kind of getting stuck. The lessons that we learned through that process were the power of paying attention, not only to detail but also to practice, and having that two-way conversation with staff. Typically, because services are so community-based, particularly with parent partnerships, you didn't really have a clear sense as a supervisor of what was happening in a home. You would get the staff come back and tell you what their perception was, but you really didn't have a clear observation of what that was. So directive supervision allowed us the structure and the opportunity to really get out into the field as supervisors to take a look at what was happening as well. It also allowed us to recognize the difference between instinct and model. So we talk here about the accident of good social work rather than having a core practice model. So we were really cognizant and aware of saying, here's our role descriptions that are competency-based, and here's our core practice model in which we want people to do the work in. We also learned painfully the importance of discipline data management. Because we were stuck in the details, and at that time we didn't have the technology piece, we had folks completing Excel spreadsheets multiple times, changing formulas, and it really bunkered down the process for a bit of time. But it also allowed us to say, let's not draw conclusions from what we're seeing in this data. Instead, what's the next question? What should we be looking at from a practice model standpoint or from a training perspective or to coach staff? What could we be looking at to do differently rather than getting stuck in what we think this data is telling us? We also learned the potential of using supervision as a means to improve the reliability. So again, establishing a consistent practice pattern with clear expectations allowed us to talk with staff around not only what they were doing with kids and families, but how they were doing it. So you enter a child and family's home, what does that look like? What are the expectations around that? Does that mean you bring your big gulp in and you're chewing gum, or what does that look like? So it really allowed us an opportunity to have those kinds of conversations that we probably weren't having previous to this model. It also allowed, with the joint supervision of some of the parent partners, it allowed us to find a home for greater implementation in in-home family services, which is one of our community-based mental health service programs. Next slide, please. So the lessons that we learned from the small-scale implementation in in-home included the importance of having and implementing the supervisory piece simultaneously with the line staff. With the parent partnerships implementation, we had not yet created the management role descriptions and rolled that piece out. So it brought to light some opportunities for us as an organization to take a look at our supervisory and management style and skill set and really refine that so that we have managers and supervisors who are coaching staff and supporting staff in the work that they're doing. So at this point, everyone in the organization, top to bottom, does directive supervision. We also, again, learned the value of the two-way communication and the importance of regular ongoing feedback. So rather than saving a conversation to have with somebody once a year as their annual appraisal, it gives you the opportunity to give them feedback on a monthly basis. Our bare minimum is on a quarterly basis. You sit down with staff and talk with them around their performance and feedback and really establish goals for moving ahead. But you can do it as frequently, really, as every month if someone's really struggling in a skill area. Part of the challenge that we found was that people were so focused on doing wraparound, they forgot to supervise to the process. So we were supervising to the paperwork, but orienting to the values. The missing piece was the supervision of the practice model. The artifacts were really around the paperwork and being oriented to the values. Pat, do you want to say more about that?
Well, I think, once the wraparound department got going, they had a very strong values-based orientation model. But the truth is they were also living in the real world of the LA County mental health system, which meant that they had forms and plans and paperwork and productivity. And what we needed to do is we needed to link the values with the practice and the artifacts in terms of what are the products that people are measuring to.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to launch the second poll now, please?
All right. All right, there we go. So we'll just give people a few more minutes. I'm sorry, a few more seconds. All right, there are the results. Majority.
For those of us without internet access here in our temporary digs, what do the results say? I found the results you described from the first poll very intriguing, that folks are definitely endeavoring, a lot of folks are endeavoring to use data from staff in their supervision. What does this one say?
Well, it looks like the majority, 59%, say that they are not, they say no, they have not, them or their supervisors who work with you or your organization directly called a family in the last month to seek their feedback about staff performance. 59% said no, 26% said yes.
Thanks very much.
So let's to mention that because that was one of the shifts within Directive Supervision. Well, there were a number of shifts attached to this, but part of our agenda was very purposeful that we wanted to increase the communication between families and supervisors, and that one of the artifacts of sort of the old model is it seemed that when families would call with a complaint, they often may be diagnosed or judged or quote unquote, it's seen as a problem. What we wanted to do is from the very first time that a family entered the agency, that supervisors were accessible and were using family feedback, not on satisfaction, but on actually performance. And so you'll see in some of the information that these guys are going to go over what that's meant in terms of opening the overall culture to family feedback on performance and codifying that in the staff performance system. It's easier said than done.
Thanks. So our large-scale implementation occurred in 2010. We kicked off in January of 2010 an agency-wide directive supervision training for all program supervisors. So we got everybody on page. We bunkered down for, I think, about 2 weeks and really ran everyone through the training. We also added 460 people onto the directivesupervision.com website, which thrilled Pat. And we started establishing ongoing reviews and feedback. We also held ongoing support implementation groups for programs and or people within programs who identified that they needed some implementation support throughout the year. Some of those folks were self-identified. Some folks we identified by using some of the data. Next slide, please. In looking at the data, we looked at multiple things. We were able to look at compliance, which is basically the frequency of people being reviewed, which translates to feedback and ongoing conversations with staff. We also looked at staff performance ratings, and we looked at who folks were talking to as third-party feedback. Our goal and our primary driving force was, like Pat said, to really incorporate family voice and improve family communication with supervisors. But we also had opportunity, because of the relationships that we have within the county, to look at other participant feedback. So how are we doing with community partners? How are we doing with Department of Children and Family Services? You know, our staff responsive to requests. We also, one of the third-party options is staff feedback for those folks who are in supervisory roles. We want to have feedback from staff who are receiving supervision from folks so that we can, of course, continue to improve and coach around performance and expectations as well. We also, that data allowed us to identify the program or supervisory areas that needed further support. And then also in February 2011, we held a leadership meeting to provide this data overview and also discuss the implementation movement within the agency. So part of what we discussed in that meeting is the importance of having our role descriptions A, consistent, and B, competency-based. And we really worked with leadership around how you translate competency and skills into capturing some of the things that are more tangible or measurable, things like productivity, paperwork, some of the business practice stuff that Pat reflected and talked to earlier. Next slide, please. So this slide is our data review of our analytic use for 2010. So it really captures the use of talent reviews and the Directive Supervision website by supervisor. So the blacked out column is supervisor names. And as you can see, we broke it down red, yellow, green. So red are folks who either did not survey people or surveyed less than one person for that month. Yellow captures between 1 and 8. And then green is more than 8, so there's multiple entries. And so what we were able to do was not only look across by supervisor and see who was struggling with usage, we could also take a look, again, because our standard is quarterly, take a look at time frames and say, what quarters are we low in? Where do we need to boost our implementation support and really maybe support people in talking with folks? more frequently. Anything you want to add on that? No. Okay. Next slide, please. This is a slide of our staff performance ratings. So the Directive Supervision rating scale is from a 1 to 7, and 4 is what we consider as meeting job expectations. So 4 is people are meeting their expectations, they're doing what they need to be doing, and then there's above and beyond that. What you can see from this graph is that the folks who drop off on the right-hand side over near the 1, we really were able to take a look at those staff and say, is this reflective of one supervisor who's rating low? Why are those folks still working here? Is that an orientation period? You know, we really got to drill down and look at that data. And luckily for us, we were able to see that those folks were, some were in an orientation period, but they were also all trending toward the middle, which is where we are really looking to get all of our folks at a 4 or above. Pat, anything you want to say? No. Okay, next slide, please. This data is for our third-party reviews. So earlier I talked about the different options that you have as soliciting feedback from third parties, and we really took a look at our grand total ratio, and we were pleased to see that the majority of third-party folks that we talked to last year were families. We did notice towards the end of the year that that was trending down, and so our goal is to increase that ratio for this year as we move ahead. The staff participant and also the other customer participant, it's at the supervisor's discretion. So we have not set any kind of standards around this is what it needs to be or that is, you know. So for us, the high number of the family participants who were surveyed really speaks to the shift in supervisors' mindsets that family voice is important and valued because they're making and initiating those calls on their own to family members.
Other customer participant types can be other customers, say county workers that are working with the program, schools, and could even be other departmental workers. So there is an ease of use with that category. So we were very happy that that wasn't as the larger of the categories because it would be the simplest thing is to walk down the hall and talk to somebody in another department.
Next slide, please. The other thing that the data review told us was that folks really felt comfortable implementing the technical aspects, so utilizing the website and completing the reviews. What it wasn't able to tell us was the frequency and quality of the implementation of the coaching and communication tools. And so what we really took a look at was having a conversation with the leadership of the organization and talking about how will you know if someone is implementing other than looking at the data? Because the data gives you a piece of the picture. It doesn't tell you if folks are being coached and supported in the work that they're doing. It doesn't tell you if folks are having supervision in a way that translates what they're doing and what they're being asked to do and attaching that to the values in which we're asking them to operate under. So some of the concrete artifacts that we talked about seeing if those adaptive tools were in place was, you know, seeing values posted on the wall, but also having staff approach supervisors with proactive coaching and saying, I need help with this. Can you help me walk through this? And really having staff, you know, solicit and ask for help using some of those tools that that are part of the directive supervision model. Next slide, please. We have been implementing directive supervision since 2004, although large scale since 2010. And so with that, we've been able to drum up some accomplishments with that. We've brought on all the programs at Kapolei Sycamores to directive supervision. And we've also identified areas of support and assistance required for leadership to support their teams more fully. So in recognizing that it's not only the responsibility of direct care staff and supervisors of those folks, but there's also a responsibility for the greater leadership in the organization to really support the supervision model, but also support the push down and the drill down so that the practice model is what we say it is on our brochure. Next slide, please. We've implemented a feedback system that allows for regular, ongoing, transparent feedback. Again, it includes the employee, supervisor, and family or other third-party rating. And we do that on a quarterly basis. We have moved the conversation from how families are with our staff to how staff are with families. So instead of trying to, quote unquote, tailor a staff's response for one family, we really say to the staff, wow, it seems like you're really struggling with this skill. Let's have a conversation of how we can, incorporate that or improve that so that all your families benefit from that. We've also integrated across departments with one supervision model that's values-based, reflective of the practice, and highlights similarities. The biggest thing that we have been able to do and continue to provide support around is integrating clinical supervision into our supervisory practice. So when we first kicked off directive supervision, you heard this language of, well, I have to do clinical supervision and then I have to do directive supervision. Really where we've come to today is that they are one and the same. So directive supervision, again, because of the translation for the role descriptions, you're able to capture your administrative supervision, your business practice supervision, as well as your clinical supervision and or practice model, all into the same conversation. So you're not having multiple supervisions around different pockets of someone's role. It's a comprehensive model that really allows for one supervision. We've also used the directive supervision model to provide merit increases to the staff based on their ratings. We have seen an increase in our staff satisfaction surveys, particularly around clarity and knowing their role and what's expected of them. We have engaged human resources as full partners in the process, thereby integrating administrative and programmatic functions. So HR sits at the table with the committee and really owns part of the model. They are responsible for keeping track of the appraisals and the reviews and really becoming partners in the coaching model before jumping into discipline. So they've been really supportive in shifting some of the culture when they get calls about staff concerns or problems and saying, have you coached them? Have you talked with them about it? Have you done a talent review and provided the feedback? So that's been a really huge support in implementing the model more fully. Next slide, please. We also have ranked above the national average in staff satisfaction surveys in recognition and growth and in leadership. And then our HR department reports an increased compliance and completion of appraisals, and we had a decrease in staff turnover by 7 staff last year. Those 7 staff alone saved the agency $56,000 in hiring costs, and then staff loss billing recapture was over $700,000. So it was quite a savings for the agency to implement the model and retain those staff. Next slide, please.
Next steps. I mean, this is a work in progress and continues to be. So we've got some pieces in place that are promising. $750,000 gets your attention. And so then the agenda for this year, number one, is to increase the percentage of third-party surveys that are dependent on family feedback. We want to increase communication and continue to open the organizational culture to family impact. And we want to see more and more conversations between supervisors and families. The second thing we need to do is we need to, this agency, as many agencies have been hit with a tremendous push around evidence-based practice or more model-centric kind of models. And while we have a fairly robust way to manage the information around staff performance, the link between staff performance and fidelity to a particular kind of model is a little tricky. And so we're in the process of creating some short-form online reliability practice dashboards. One for Wraparound that would allow a supervisor to go in and input certain practices and then measure to those practices based on family feedback and the staff response, and then chunk that back to this whole idea of fidelity. That Wraparound is one of those. There are probably a dozen other evidence-based practices that the agency is trying to manage at this time. So there's a correlation there. We're also needing to enhance the database with some business features. One of the things we've been doing is really working to get people to do the technical aspects and start to look at staff practice and performance. But what happened is when we started to correlate that with some of the business features, for example, productivity or paperwork follow-through, we found that the ratings didn't necessarily chunk up. So we're integrating some of those business features or departmental performance features into the website so that a supervisor has that dashboard and can correlate both the business practice and the practice. And then we want to increase the integration of the quarterly talent review process for all supervisors. So it's not the end of the year and we're trying to get it done, but that we see that staff have an opportunity to get critical, supportive, concrete feedback at least 4 times throughout the year, and that when it comes time for the annual appraisal, we continue to move with that sort of one-button approach where it's time for, HR says it's time for the annual appraisal, you simply can press a button and it will aggregate the sum total of your conversations through the year, which moves it away from the annual appraisal as a big event to the annual appraisal as a summary of an ongoing conversation.
So probably the biggest takeaway in the implementation of directive supervision is really shifting the practice model, is really a shift in supervision, because staff respond to their supervisor and what they are supervised to do or directed to do. And for those who provide directive supervision, it's really moving towards more of a shared decision-making model with families, which means then that the supervisors have to be able to prepare their staff to be a participant in the process of collaborative help rather than being the expert decision maker. So typically, supervision has been an employee comes to their supervisor, tells them about the family, the supervisor tells them what to do, and then the employee goes out and does that. And that's no longer the practice that's happening within Hathaway Sycamores. Instead, it's more of a collaborative process where we're building the skills and competency in the employees to participate to help families and the team make better decisions. So I think we're going to move on to question and answers.
All right, so if anyone in the audience has any questions for the presenters, you can either type them in or you can raise your hand. If you guys want to start with some of the typed in questions, I have one here. What types of questions are included in the third-party surveys? Does each question have a rating scale?
Yeah, each participant, each third-party participant, whether it's family, staff, or other customer, has a set of questions with also the 1 to 7 rating scale. As the supervisor talking with the third party, you have the option of asking them for concrete numbers, but there's also area for narrative. So typically what we do is have an open-ended dialogue conversation with folks, and then we reflect back to them, is this what I heard you say, is this what I captured, and then based on that, is this an appropriate rating for the conversation we just had. So you have the flexibility to do that as well.
The original pilot, we tried calling families. This is what Gloria got to do, call families and ask families to answer all the questions on the job descriptions. And we found that Gloria had no other time except to call families and ask them all those questions. And by the end, the ratings became, they just became, oh yeah, I'll give them a whatever the rating was. This is much more practice sensitive, and this also presupposes that the supervisor has a mental model of what good practice looks like. The other thing we wanted to be clear about is we didn't want to put a family in the position of worrying about negatively rating somebody who was helping them for a variety of reasons. Part of them was fear of retribution. Part of it was, well, I really like this person. They just don't perform. So it really comes down to the supervisor identifying that.
Okay, great. We have a hand raised from an audience member. Barbara Fearing, are you on the line? You can ask your question now.
Okay. I'm here with my colleague who we're just sharing an office. She had registered, but In terms of the family participant survey, we were just kind of wondering if you have any sample questions or what that would look like. Would it be asking them about the phases of wraparound or staff performance? And if you had any samples, that would be helpful.
This is Gloria. It's a mixture, yes, of the phases of help. One of the first questions I believe asked is, when you first met your parent partner, do you remember how the parent partner described their role, talking about what their role looked like?
Okay.
That's one of the ones. Some of the others are in the transition phase, might be a question. When the family decided that they had met their goals and were ready to graduate, did the parent partner help you connect to resources in your community, or was there a resource book that was given to you to help you find the informal supports or the different resources in your community? And the questions are all pretty much based on the various phases of help within Wraparound.
Well, and the questions aren't tied to specific wraparound practices, which is one of the reasons why we're bringing on these other more practice-sensitive databases. The questions really came down to what Debbie said originally, which is she didn't want a boutique and she didn't want 100 kids served very well in a wraparound department and 8,400 other kids served not so well in other departments. So there was really a process where people looked at the organized all service around these 4 phases and said, what does good help look like? And good help looks like at the front door, people are clear about what their role is and what you can expect. People will make sure that they take care of any emergent kind of concerns. The planning phase, your perspective was heard and understood. The implementation phase really is focused a lot on follow-through in a timely fashion for you. And as Gloria said, the transition phase is really about shifting the process of help from ending something to, are you getting the kind of support so that you can be well connected in community?
Okay, great. So we have another typed in question. How difficult was it for the supervisors to make the shift to this particular model of supervision, and how was their transition managed to ensure success?
Well, you can't hear us, but we're laughing. A painful laugh at that. I think for the supervisors, Tanya talked about a little bit. At first, they were doing dual supervision, and we worked hard to help them integrate the two. And part of doing that changed when their supervisor started using directive supervision with them. So it was a parallel process, and it was easier for them to embrace and to understand and to apply. So it didn't happen overnight. It was fairly well, what can I say, regulated, I guess. We didn't allow exceptions, and we had to have a lot of difficult conversations with some supervisors. We continue to have those difficult conversations, and when we hire supervisors, we let them know that this is the way we provide supervision, and we introduce it to them in the interview and then again in orientation. So we either have people that are converted at the get-go and inspired by it and become one of the leaders in making sure it happens, or we need to monitor the use of supervision, as you could see from that red, green, and yellow patterned graph that we showed.
All right, so we have a couple questions from people asking if it's possible to share the surveys or if the questionnaires that were used for reviews could be posted on the NWI website.
can you get more information about what they want? Because I guess that's the question. Yeah, I guess we could post it, but it'd be a lot of junk in, a lot of junk out in terms of the job description.
Okay. I think that maybe they're talking about the review, the questionnaire. I suppose I'm not exactly sure. But if you have any materials that could give people an example of what you've been used, maybe it could be possible to post them online.
Yeah, we can figure something out that would be, I think that could be helpful to people, don't you think?
Yeah, we could probably just dummy one up.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, it looks like someone was referring to the satisfaction surveys.
We don't do satisfaction surveys.
They don't do satisfaction. Okay. There you go. All right.
Actually, we do satisfaction surveys within the organization, but the satisfaction surveys are not the third-party participant survey in Directive Supervision. So in Directive Supervision, the third-party questions or the family participant questions, we're not asking if someone is satisfied. We're asking if there was the presence of an activity provided by their team, one of the participants on their team, and the activity is specific to the role. So that's the question. We don't, I mean, they may tell us that they're satisfied. We do satisfaction surveys, but that comes out of our program evaluation department, and it's not directly correlated to an employee. It's correlated to an overall department, which we do have very high satisfaction ratings, higher than the national average, both for employees and for consumers.
Okay, great. So back to the questions. We've got one question that's got both a comment and a question following up. It says, while I am confident in this methodology will increase success, however, I have learned of the trappings of using absolutes for this field. My question is, do you have trainings or tools you have found effective to increase supervisors' assertive skills in order to maximize the success of direct supervision?
Yeah, that's the communication and the coaching skills, which Tanya refers to as the adaptive components of the model. That's number one. Number two, we want to, the database is a tool. And so one of the reasons why we why we move the third-party questions to more general questions is we're expecting supervisors to make the right size inference. What we're very clear about here is that the practice model is never more important than the family. And so part of what we want to do is open the dialogue and have supervisors identify the right size practices for each family they talk to, and then use that to be able to correlate staff competence in delivering the practice model that we think is our best estimate of the best way to do business with families. You want to add to that?
No, I mean, the main thing is really around, I think, the coaching and communication piece from, supervisor up to management. I mean, I think the main catalyst for us is really the culture shift that we were able to do because we had the leadership support, buy-in, and implementation. So once we implemented up to the vice president, we really got to see the shift because the directive supervision model was being done top to bottom. So, vice presidents, assistant vice presidents, directors, they were all able to see coaching opportunities are supportive and really provide clarity around how to do it and how to do the supervision. And so that experience in itself, I think, allowed for greater buy-in and support for the supervisors to go forth and implement with their direct care staff.
Okay, so we also have a couple questions about the WFI and other fidelity measures, like the TOM or the WFI. How do they fit into directive supervision model? And also, how does this relate to using the WFI for surveying partners and families?
We use the WFI in our Wraparound program, and we have used it before in our ResWrap pilot program. We look at those as fidelity measures, and they are not in any way used as a supervision tool. So they're two totally separate instruments. So in the same way that we don't correlate outcomes to employees, we don't correlate our fidelity measures to individual employee skill and competency. So we could draw from a WIFI scores in our wraparound department, which are very high, that all of our staff are competent in providing a wraparound model and approach. But what we know is that may be true as an average, but that there are individuals who need to improve their practice and need to improve their skill. And we only know that through our directive supervision.
Okay, next question. Families often want to know what is done with their feedback. How do you communicate with families about what you are doing and what is done with their feedback?
We have a form that we provide families at our initial meeting with them that highlights our supervision model and discusses with them, as well as the staff discuss with them, that they may be called from time to time and ask questions and input on the services that they are receiving. We also, on that form, provide the supervisor's name and phone number so that if families want to have a conversation with a supervisor, they are encouraged to do so proactively at the start of services. Yeah, because in the survey it's anonymous, so when staff are given feedback on their third-party information, we don't name who the family or third-party participant is. And so we let families know that as well.
Okay, great. So we've got a couple questions about the role of supervisors. Do supervisors do observations in the field of their staff? And also, could you give an example of what staff supervision looks like each week?
Supervisors do provide observations in the field. It's more frequent and intensive in the orientation period, which we have allowed a 5-month orientation period here at this organization. So when someone first comes on board, not only do they shadow staff who are already providing the service, but when they start to see kids and families on their own, their supervisor goes with them, and that supervisor provides in-the-moment coaching. So if a staff member is kind of stepping off the practice model in that session, the supervisor can step in and redirect and coach the staff back to what the practice model is. And what was the second part of the question? Oh, the weekly supervision. It generally looks like bringing in the role description and talking about areas that they've identified in their previous supervision and or talent review, areas that they've identified that they need to grow in, or areas that have come to light either via the supervisor or third-party participant where skill improvement is needed. And that may look like, with each coaching, it also provides opportunity to provide a practice model. So it may be role-playing. It may be observing somebody who does it the way you want them to do it. We don't use supervision as case consultation or to kind of come in and talk about specific families and where they're at, or where a family may be triggering a staff. We really look at it more as, how is this staff intervening, and how are they coming along in their competency with their skill set.
All right. So another question. After you have identified the focus area for improvement, what are some strategies you use to coach staff? Are there any tools to help support wraparound coaches in the how-to piece?
Well, I'm not sure about supporting wraparound coaches, because I'm not sure whether that's separate from supervision. Within directive supervision, we have a detailed set of coaching expectations, and we estimate it takes several months for supervisors to be competent in that model. And I mean, they're pretty, well, they're very specific, but they're pretty basic. We went to both social learning and adult learning theories to develop a very behaviorally based coaching model. The first is proactive, and it really defines 5 steps towards explaining to staff what you want them to do, why you want them to do it, when you want them to do it, and who you want them to do it with. And then it closes the loop by asking staff to follow up if they've actually done it. And one of the things we're aware of is that when we tell staff to do this, that they may apply it in a variety of different ways, and before you know it, by the time you get back out there and check again, they're drifting from the original design, and so then you've got a different problem. We've also created a fairly robust, focused, but accountable coaching correction component, which requires the supervisor to go through 8 concrete steps with the employee to correct the behavior, and we want to see folks doing that sooner rather than later. Part of what we're going to be monitoring this year is to see if the number of HR referrals go down in the presence of those coaching models. Now, when we first introduced these interactive tools, what we found is, as with anything else, people would say we're doing it, but we weren't necessarily sure that they were really incorporating all of it, or they were doing some of it, or they weren't doing it in order. So one of the things we created were some forms that could be used as a way to reinforce the skill set in supervisors. The point is not to do the form. The point is to hold the interaction. At some point, when people get skilled in this model of coaching with staff, we would anticipate that maybe the form use would either decrease, but that if we went into the field and saw supervisors organizing around their craft of supervision, we would see the use of these coaching tools happening in a frequent, moment-by-moment, just-in-time, real kind of way. You guys want to add anything with that?
This is Gloria. What my parent partners found very helpful was in the 5-step teaching a skill, they would actually have a step-by-step guide written down that they could follow and reference at a later point in time. They were able to have this with them until they felt like they, I won't say mastered the skill, but got a good handle on the skill, and then we could go on to something else. But it's written there for them. Anyone else?
All right. So next question is, excuse me, was there a trial run period provided before it was counted on evaluations to provide everyone with a learning period?
Well, actually, this last year was the first time it actually counted as an evaluation and tied to any kind of merit increase. So for a long time, we were doing more of a parallel process. And one of the reasons that we were doing it that way, when we started using the coaching forms and started writing down how to do something for employees, they perceived that as being written up. And we didn't want them to have an aversion to directive supervision. And we also didn't want supervisors to feel like every interaction was a punitive interaction with their employees. And so we tried to keep it separate until folks were comfortable with the process, both receiving it and also providing that kind of supervision. And so it was just this year that we began to incorporate the scores in directive supervision and assigning a merit increase to the scoring, and that was quite interesting in itself. But we are going to continue to do that. At this point, we didn't really mandate the percentage of increase. It was more of a guide for supervisors to use. But next year we're going to refine that process as we are more proficient at ensuring that the supervisors are not skewing the data just so that they can give their employees a raise. So that's one of the goals that we have this year, and that's one of the reasons why we're really monitoring the use and the scores and looking at scores that are really inflated and scores that are really low.
The other thing has to do with mastery of the directive supervision tools for supervisors. So one of the things we built into the system is both a quality rating and a follow-through rating. The follow-through rating is very easily completed by the supervisor that says, have you done this in terms of what we consider the core capacities? But then they have to seek feedback from their supervisor that says, answers the question, have you done it well? And we've set a standard agency-wide around these tools around the model, and we'll be continuing to monitor the implementation with that. The other thing to be aware of is as these guys talk about, the power of doing this from the top through the bottom of the organization. The truth is, as a supervisor, if you're using directive supervision as a club, chances are great when you start querying as third parties, your subordinates, that's going to start to come out. So what we're trying to do is take a look at the process elements, but then correlate it to some of these bigger business elements to say, is this the right way to get the very best help delivered in the shortest amount of time for families?
All right. So one question. Are you available to provide trainings for LA counties and or RAP agencies? Or is there any training options in LA County?
Who?
Or are there other training options in LA County that you know of?
No, not in this model.
Okay, great. So another question. I understand the value of live coaching. However, I supervise staff that are 300 miles away. How would you recommend providing live coaching in this scenario?
Oh, well, actually, several things. Having the data system allows you to be able to, from both sides, look at what you're seeing. And so when we move from the hell of the Excel spreadsheet that we burden Gloria with to an online system, we found that people could have different access to it. Clearly the coaching tools, as we've identified them, are interactive. They can be delivered face-to-face. They can be delivered over the phone. And it's all chunked up to these quarterly talent reviews. So at least once a quarter, there's a formal reflective moment where you and your employee say, are we practicing the way we practice? The same is true with these guys, is that they supervise all over the county. And what I've learned about LA County is it doesn't matter if you go 1 block or 100 miles. It always takes at least an hour. And so they are also in the position of having to do more distance supervision and use the online tools and the coaching tools and the talent reviews to be able to get that information together for staff. What the website does is it creates an online file cabinet for supervisors to keep track of the progress towards competence. You guys want to add something to that?
The only challenge that we have found in that kind of distance supervision is really around the observation piece. So the question becomes, do you have support from a supervisory standpoint in place in other locations that can provide that ongoing observation, coaching, feedback piece to staff if you are housed, 100 miles away?
Okay, so we just have a couple more questions. Hopefully we can get through, and in the next couple of minutes we're getting close to 12:30 Pacific, anyways. So, what instruction/direction did supervisors provide their staff when making the shift so they would be aware of the change and participate in it?
We created an employee handbook to directive supervision that we rolled out to all staff in the organization. That really, it was kind of a bullet point, but also Q&A type model of how will your supervision look different? What can you expect? Does this mean your supervisor is out to get you? So all those questions that we were fielding in the pilot and the small implementation process, we put into an employee handbook and rolled that out. Employees that come to our door today now receive that as part of their orientation packet.
All right, and the last question we'll take today. You were beginning to describe some questions that were asked of families. Could you go over some examples?
No, I don't have much.
I think we're going to try to pull them up and see if we can get a couple questions.
Okay. So a couple questions in the meantime are coming in about the PowerPoint presentation. It will be available on the NWI website later today, and you'll also be emailed a direct link with a follow-up. So that information will be coming.
Yeah, we don't have the questions. We don't have the questions in front of us, and unfortunately, our computer is locked up looking at this slide. So, and there are for the family questions there are 12, 3 in each phase, and they really and the questions that were identified were really chosen by consensus among everybody here at the agency that said this is a placeholder for the best possible practice we can deliver.
Okay, great. Well, I believe that's all the questions that we have today from our audience. So we can wrap up the webinar. Do you guys have any closing remarks?
No. Do you, Debbie? I don't think so.
Okay, well, thanks for everyone for joining, and thanks to all of our presenters. This was a great webinar. I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and I'm going to sign off now.
Thank you.
Thank you.